Some of you have probably heard Zoom itself has its own security and privacy concerns. I think that actually introduces some interesting conversation that maybe we can have later about how the ease of use and convenience of some technologies can sometimes outweigh the particular privacy and security concerns. But that's a bit further down the road. We can get to that. So I am Daly Barnett. I am a staff technologist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I am here today sort of halfway on behalf of them, and also I am a data witch at Hacking Hustling. So I'm coming from kind of like a weird intersection from both the sex working community and the information security community. A bit about the EFF. It was founded in 1990. It is a nonprofit law firm that we say champions user privacy, free expression, and innovation through impact litigation, policy analysis, activism, and technology development. It's a lot of word stuff there just to say that basically we focus on making sure when you go online, your rights go with you. So there's sort of three branches there. There's the legal side of things, the activism side, and the side that I work in, which is the technology side. That said, I am not an attorney. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not here to give formal legal advice. However, if you do have any questions, please always feel free to reach out to me. My email is there, but I'll show it again at the end for you as well. And obviously, we're also all here because of Hacking Hustling. I think it goes without introduction. Hacking Hustling is so good and amazing, but I think that Blunt could probably give a better introduction to Hacking Hustling than I could right now.
Sure, it'd be my pleasure. Hi, my name's Blunt. I am an organizer with Hacking Hustling. I'm also a sex worker, a professional dominatrix. And Hacking Hustling was formed in response to Sesta Fosta. And we organized 2-day series of workshops and trainings by and for sex workers and community to talk about digital security concerns that came up after Fosta Sesta. And so I'm really excited. I've been working with Daly for around almost exactly 2 years since Fosta Sesta was signed into law. And we're really excited to be here and answer questions. I wanna just take a second to say that we're talking to a broad audience at the moment. So we're doing our best to make sure that this information is tailored to the community, but of course everyone has their own security concerns. And so we hope to take some time at the end to answer those questions, to address any of those issues. And Daly will get more into this throughout the presentation. So great, take it away, Daly. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to outline some goals for this workshop. First, we're going to create a map of your individual digital footprint. That'll make a bit more sense later. I want to cover some basics of threat modeling, what that is and how you can apply it. And then we're going to learn about kind of like the meat of the conversation, talking about some different technologies and tactics that you can use to better your personal data hygiene plan to address your threat model and digital footprint map. It'll all make more sense later. And then, of course, at the end, as Blunt mentioned, we'll have a portion for Q&A and a bit of community discussion. So let's get started. And sort of the prelude to getting started, I wanted to cover some basic working definitions for some things that you'll hear a lot. I wish we didn't have to use such technical terms for things. Unfortunately, we do sometimes when researching how to implement your own practices. So first, you're going to hear a lot about data, which doesn't always make a lot of working sense for the, I think, like average person that has to engage with computers. When it comes down to it, data is just information. It's information that your computer, your cell phone, any sort of computerized device, your banking card, it's the information that they use to function and compute, share, and do the things that you expect them to do. There's also a phrase called metadata, which is data about data. That's why I put the little exploding head there, because it can be a weird concept to wrap your head around, but it's important to note when you are thinking about your personal data hygiene practice, because sometimes there's the data that you're consciously developing, and then there's the data about data that you're unconsciously or subconsciously creating just by interacting with the device. And you want to be conscious of that because that still has an impact on your personal privacy. So I've already mentioned a couple times, data hygiene. This is a phrase I use often about the practice and routine of being mindful about the data that you're producing. I liken it to any sort of hygienic practice. It is a practice. It takes practice. It's a routine. And I've also likened it in the past in these types of workshops to a sort of personal sexual hygienic practice, in that it's a community one. So anyone that you share yourself with in that way, like speaking of data, you are protecting them by implementing your own good data hygienic practice. And you might expect them for others to do that for you and to care for you. It is a way of caretaking for your community. If somebody else's privacy and security is compromised and you're close with them, it can have implications for your own privacy and security. Okay, so threat modeling. This is another phrase you're going to hear a lot when it comes to information security and beefing up your own personal data hygiene plan. Threat modeling is unfortunately a term that we've co-opted from military use. However, it's still useful and you'll hear it a lot. So I think we should just take it and run with it and make it our own. It is a way of thinking about the sorts of protection that you want for your data, so you can decide which potential threats you're going to take seriously. Threat modeling is usually followed by what we call risk assessment. Basically, it's just sort of thinking through and prioritizing the possible things that could compromise your personal privacy and security, and then deciding which has more of a likelihood of happening, which has a bigger impact if it does happen, which you want to prioritize first. Here are some common questions that we've come up with at the EFF when it comes to developing your own personal threat model. They're super useful, and I feel like these 6 questions you can take starting right now and go out with them and create your own personal threat model without any sort of other formal knowledge about information security. So I definitely recommend screenshotting this if you can, or I'll give some links at the end where you can find a much more thorough guide on developing your own threat model. Okay, now this is the last one, OPSEC. This is another clunky military phrase that we've co-opted, but you will hear it a lot, and you may have already heard it. It just means operations security, and it's the steps that you might take to keep your stuff secure. So I think of it as like the next step after threat modeling and risk assessment. It's what your answer is to when you say what to do in the event of blank. And that blank is one of the things that came up when you were developing your own threat model. I do want to say, I'm going to make the, I think, safe assumption that everyone here in some way is or has been involved in the sex industry. And I guarantee then that you are already better than most at this. Like, definitely. I've always loved giving trainings to sex workers because we're so much better at OPSEC than so many InfoSec people I know, which is just super cool. Okay. So that was a lot of definitions and like wordy stuff thrown at you. I'm so sorry for that. It is useful and they'll come up more and be a little bit more useful in a second. This is just to take a break for a deep breath because I know I need it, and some more coffee.
I'm breathing with you daily. I also think that like sex workers are just inherently like OPSEC experts. Like we are mostly using pseudonyms anyways without even thinking of it as a form of security. And I think there's a bunch of things that we do without even necessarily like before I started doing these trainings with Hacking Hustling, I wouldn't have considered this language to go with any of the practices I used with my work. But afterwards, I was like, oh, I'm already doing a bunch of these things, which made me feel a lot better.
Yeah, I think that we often have like the most sophisticated uses of language and communication with each other that, like, frankly, we could be teaching people in InfoSec about. You know, the way that we can create very useful and productive whisper networks with each other is much more sophisticated than a lot of the hackers I know.
Yeah, and
Okay.
I'm excited for your next slides. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, no problem. So I mentioned it before, but if you have pen and paper handy, get it ready. If you don't, grab one while I go through the next couple of slides, because this is when we're going to get a bit more interactive. So now we're going to be talking about mapping your digital footprint. Um, it is literally creating like a map. Here's the legend for the map that I'm proposing you use. Um, we'll talk about the devices, which are like literally the hardware things you use, like the phones you use, the computer that you're using now. They could be your personal devices. It can also be maybe a family computer you might be working on. Maybe you visit the library to use their computers. Any device that you use to log in or do any of your sort of online personal business or caretaking. So then that online stuff you're doing, you can symbolize with the little cloud that's in the middle there. This can be a whole array of different things. It could be the different email accounts that you use. It can be the different social media accounts that you use, maybe the different listing services you use, payment processors. There's a bunch of stuff that can go in there, and you probably won't have time to list them all right now. But I think the first ones that come to mind when doing this exercise are usually the most important ones. And of course, later you can make a more fleshed out and sophisticated version where you have all of your accounts listed. And then the third type of thing that will happen on this map are people. Um, don't list every person you interact with. That's like cuckoo. I think it's much more useful to sort of categorize them as the types of people that you interact with. So like, you know, from my point of view, I have like my vanilla life, day job, and all the professional people in that world. And then maybe I've got some people in my other life, right, where uh, friends and maybe coworkers or whatever that I would prioritize differently. Then I've got family, which is different from all of those. Then I've got other friends, which are different from all of those. And then there are clients, which is a whole different category. Um, and depending on your own personal point of view, you probably have some other categories I haven't thought of. Okay, so here's an example digital footprint map for Catwoman. You can see she's got 2 devices. She's got just a couple of, or like a few different accounts that she uses online, and she only has 3 people that she's interacting with. But when so she's mapped these out, right? And then the goal is you want to begin to visualize how data is passed between these different things, which data is being shared, if that makes sense. So when she maps hers, it might look like this. She uses her personal computer to log into just a couple of her accounts. But then her cell phone, she uses to log into her Catwoman email address. So like her criminal lifestyle is only through her cell phone.
Daly, could you use the mouse to sort of trace those paths just to visually
Oh,
illustrate it?
you can see my mouse. Good. Okay, so you can see that she's using her personal computer to speak with her cousin Betty, which is sort of like, sounds like her like vanilla lifestyle, right? She's also using her Facebook account to talk to cousin Betty. And those are all taking place through like her Gmail account too. But then there's her cell phone, which is linked to her Catwoman email address. She uses that to speak to Batman and the Joker. Um, so you can imagine that there might be lots of different ways that you'll be drawing connections between either the clouds, the people, and the devices. There isn't really a strict way of doing this. Like I said, the goal is just to visualize which data is being transferred and how it's being connected across these different things. So before we move into your part, where you get to do a little bit of visualizing your own and creating your own, um, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions and like hopefully get some responses from y'all about, first, what's good about Catwoman's digital footprint as it is now, and where can you see on here that she could be doing better? How could she better contain those pathways so that her digital privacy and security are a bit stronger?
Awesome. And feel free to use the chat to answer Daly's question, and I'll just read those out for this part. So people are saying she has a personal and professional things going to the same device. She's using separate devices for different quote unquote lives. Her cell is just for Catwoman business. Pretty good. She has separate email accounts to interact with different people. So that's what I'm getting on the chat. One thing that I noticed is that she's also using what seems to be like her, if Batman and the Joker are her clients in this exercise is how I'm seeing it. I'm also seeing that she's talking to Betty on that. So I'm wondering if she doesn't care that Betty might be connected to that work. So that's the one thing that, yeah, someone's saying there's some insecurity in still using her personal cell phone, her personal device, her cell phone as a personal device.
Totally. Yeah. And yeah, there's no way to know if that's because she has a level of trust for Cousin Betty or if it's just like a mistake. Maybe once she did accidentally communicate with Cousin Betty through that one pathway. So now that pathway has been created. And although maybe she could not use that pathway ever again and it could grow stale, as we would say, it's still been there, right? So that data has been produced. Great. Yeah, those are all great points. So let's move forward into mapping a bit of your own then. So we can take a couple of minutes here. I totally advise starting to do this. Use this legend. Don't share it with us. This is very private. This is like just for you to keep for yourself. Yeah, and if you have any questions, please throw them in the chat. And Blunt, if you can keep an eye on that, because I don't have it open because of my screen share.
Yep.
Thanks. So we'll take like a few minutes.
So someone's saying, would it help if Catwoman uses a platform like Google Voice when using her phone? And someone else asking, how does a burner app on your cell phone map to the device's data? Is there a way to minimize harm when you can't afford a second cell phone? So these are all great questions that
Super good questions that I've got like immediate thoughts to, but I'm okay. As far as like burner apps, I'm gonna save that for the end. Whoever brought that up, please bring it up again when we get to the Q&A. I think what you can take from that now when you're making this sort of digital footprint map is if you're using a burner app or any sort of what we would call like a virtualization software on like your cell phone to make like a different phone number that you would use to talk to someone else.
So like a Google Voice or like Signal through a Google Voice or something like that.
Yeah, you can visualize that on your map by maybe putting like, that's gonna be a cloud, right? So I'd put that cloud above your device because you're still only using one phone, right? But then you're using maybe this virtualization software is what we would call it. And that then is going to connect the different like people or accounts that you're using. It'll act as a sort of intermediary. but it's still tied to the one device. And this is a really common tactic that people use, like virtualization software or sort of like intermediary softwares that um, uh, bolster privacy and security by kind of acting as like as a middleman.
Yeah.
Or,
Someone's asking, can you expand on what growing stale is? Is it worth changing your accounts once it's been linked on the device?
yeah, so in information security and uh, uh, well, and so I'm also like a developer, like a coder. And so there's this idea of like data growing stale over time where like it just sort of ages and doesn't really become, or it becomes crappy. Maybe it doesn't work anymore for the particular software that relies on it, or it becomes like meaningless in a way, or just becomes lost to the annals of time. That's sort of like what stale means when it comes to data. Uh, and whether, or it's nearly impossible. It's so contextual. It's nearly impossible to say if there's no given length of time where something is so stale that it's useless. I feel like any information can be useful depending on the context. Um, this kind of reminds me of the phrase we often toss around, there is no perfect security. There's always a compromise and exchange of trust when it comes to doing anything online.
Right. And I think it's important to think about all of this as a form of harm reduction. Like I'm seeing some questions right now about like if you like what can you do if you can't afford multiple devices? Many people who are trading sex don't have a personal, even one personal device that they're using and use a shared device. And there's always something that you can do to reduce your harm no matter where you're coming from. And we hope to address that as well in some of the questions. I have two more questions that I'm gonna read to you, and then maybe we can move forward and save some of the questions that we didn't get to for the end. Does that sound good, Daly? Okay. How important is it to have a separate device for separate people, specifically vanilla people versus working people? I can understand separate emails, app accounts, or usernames, but I think separating devices is hard since so much media is convergent nowadays.
Yeah.
Personally, I would want to be able to do just about everything on my cell.
Yeah, totally. It's not feasible to expect people to have multiple devices for their different use cases. That is totally cuckoo. Like, even I'm a huge computer nerd, and I love having like the ease of use and convenience of having one computer I can do everything on. Um, as Blunt has said now, like numerous times, this is about harm reduction. Um, you can really do a lot for yourself, even if you only have one device you're doing everything on, even if that device isn't just yours. Maybe you're sharing that device with others, family or other friends, or maybe it's like the libraries or something. I'm going to go over many steps throughout this, the rest of this talk that you can still use when using a device like that. Um, and it all depends on your personal point of view, your personal threat model. Um, yeah, that's sort of why I'm starting with like these visualization exercises, because that can be a much more useful beginning, no matter what your particular point of view is or the access to materials or devices you already have.
Yeah, and just like safer sex looks different for everyone. Like there is no such thing as safe sex. Like it's safer sex. It's the same with these
Yep.
digital security tools. Someone says, wouldn't using Signal solve privacy issues? That I use it to talk to Batman. I'm dying at that comment.
We'll go over Signal later, or secure messaging. So I'm going to save that for later. Okay, I
I'm
want to
going
move.
to save the rest of these for later. These are all really awesome questions. And I ask you when we open it up for questions, just copy and paste them and throw them in the chat again.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on. Take another break for breath. This can be, if you've drawn the connections already between those different things on your map, it can sometimes be really stressful to like begin to visualize how these things are connected and how many different like vectors of concern or vectors of attack there are in your particular model. that can be really, really stressful. But again, this is about harm reduction, and the vast majority of different like cyber attacks or doxing attempts or other things you have to worry about, usually they're not that sophisticated. I'm not going to say that they're all not sophisticated, but you know, like you can really do a lot with a little, and I believe in you. Okay, so let's get into the meat of it. This is the real stuff now. Technologies and tactics that you can use to address your now drawn map and beginning to think about your particular threat model. The biggest thing I want to talk about in this is like sort of what I want to think of as like the climax of this conversation, is compartmentalization. This is a concept we use in information security, and it is like the biggest, most important, and easiest thing to implement that'll have the biggest impact on your particular point of view. This is just drawing conscious, distinct boundaries about where those flows of data are going, and like drawing the boundaries and limits around them. It's consciously choosing the purposes and limiting them to those purposes for your different devices, your accounts, the browser sessions. That is like literally when you open a browser and when you close a browser. The app, like the different applications you're using. It's for everything. It's when you talk to like your mother, you're not going to tell mom everything about what your day-to-day life is about, right? That is an act of compartmentalization. You're compartmentalizing the flow of information that goes to your parents versus, you know, your friend or like me or whoever. So some more examples of that would be creating an email address that's solely used for registering an account for listing your business online. Using a different phone number. That could be through like another phone that you buy, or through like a virtualization software that you put on top of the one device. That's still a method of compartmentalization. Another way of considering it is, like I mentioned, when you close your internet browser entirely, starting a new one up, maybe with an incognito mode, as they say, and then maybe even more hardened privacy settings. Maybe you click on a VPN to even like further the hardening the privacy and security of your browser session into a new session. Those are all methods of compartmentalization. And I really cannot stress that enough. It is a very useful way of beginning to visualize containing what you're doing, how you're doing it. Okay, so now let's talk about passwords. The one thing I will say is you should always, always, always use long, unique passwords for every account that you make. Here's a good strategy I list here for using a word list and some dice to randomly generate a password that is like strings of words that are kind of strung together, like could be perfect outside matte granola. It's off the top of my head. Makes no sense. It's kind of easy for you to remember, but it's actually quite difficult for a computer to crack, as long as it's fairly long. So thinking about that, if you have like a password that is long and unique for every single account or thing you have to log into, that's like not tenable at all for anyone to have to remember, which is what brings us to password managers. A password manager is a piece of software that helps you create, often, store, and keep track of all the different passwords that you use. These are usually accessible through what they call a master password, which means you have one password that you use to log into your password manager. So if you begin to visualize like your threat model now in this way, or like your digital device footprint map, you have a new cloud formed that is your password manager. That's now a single point of failure is what we call. So you have one password that is like the one ring to rule them all, right? It's the one password that has access to all of your other passwords. That can be scary for some. So maybe you want to invest in a password manager that has really particularly high security, or maybe it's not hosted in a cloud, maybe, which means that it's somebody else's computer who has it. There are password managers that are just applications you can keep just on your device and you don't have to be online to use. A lot of these have like browser plugins that are super handy. I prefer ones like that. Maybe the security isn't the best for that, but that's another example of the ease of use and convenience of it outweighs maybe the like, minute concern that it maybe isn't the most secure. Here are some examples of password managers. I'm not formally recommending these because I can't do that as a representative of the EFF. I will say, though, that personally, I do use these in my day-to-day life. And there's a pro tip there on the bottom for even more intense containerization around this. You can use different password managers for different aspects of your online self. So if you are concerned about that, you can keep one account for your like vanilla day-to-day life. Then you can have one for your Catwoman life, right? Okay, so now let's move on to secure messaging. We spoke a bit about this earlier. Someone brought up Signal. Is usually the most common one I think people are aware of nowadays when it comes to talking about secure messaging. Secure messaging is just a phrase we toss around now to describe different methods or applications or protocols of communications that is encrypted. You don't have to know what encryption is about unless you're like a real nerd. I don't recommend like going into the nitty-gritty of that. It is like not really useful for you. It is useful as a term to look for, though, when you're choosing technologies that you want to use. Encryption is good. It helps us. It keeps things private and it keeps things secure. These are some other examples listed on the screen of different secure messaging platforms. Some of these emulate a sort of like texting style interface, like what you use on your phone. Signal is like that. WhatsApp uses the same software that Signal uses. It's very texting-like. Then there are ones like Keybase, which is easily transferable from a computer to a phone or to a website-like interface. So you can log into it easily from multiple devices that maybe you don't own or control. Okay, here's a fun one. Another tactic you can use, this isn't so much a technology, this is something you might actually be pretty good at already. This is called steganography, and it's just the practice of hiding messages in plain sight. A lot of this, like classically, we think of it as like when you have like a string of letters that look like nonsense, and then you can like decipher them into code that's telling someone to like, the hidden treasure is found on Treasure Island. Be there at 2 o'clock or whatever. Another example we can think of this as is people using, I think this is a little outdated now, but like using rose emojis in like Instagram accounts and stuff was a way of kind of like silently signaling that it was a work account. That's an example of steganography in action, where it's sort of like if you're in the know, you're in the know. You're probably, like I said, already pretty good at this, but if you consciously think of that definition or of that practice, you can then more consciously apply it to your day-to-day digital life. Do you have to say things clearly in order to get your message across? Do you have to say things that are going to hold you legally culpable for the actions you might be implying? Are you using your real name on Zoom? Right? These are all like examples of where steganography can be applied to protect yourself. Okay, another technology to use, VPNs. You've probably heard of this before. These are just virtual private networks. It is another example of the type of technology I described earlier that is called virtualization. So you can imagine like your device, this is my phone. I can add a VPN on top of this so that it sort of acts as like a layer between this and everything it does to talk to the internet and other computers through internet protocols. VPNs are, they're not like save all. Like I often hear people like describe using a VPN and just say, well, like just get a VPN, it protects you from everything. That's not how it actually works. Really, all it does is it can, you can make it look like you're appearing from somewhere else in the world. So if you're trying to dodge censorship or other geo restrictions, like if you're in another country where you don't have access to like your Hulu or Netflix account or something, you can use a VPN to like suddenly you're now in the UK and you do have access to it. A lot of these do cost money, but some of them I recommend like using for special use cases because they'll be free to use up to a certain point. Like they'll only let you use so much data through them before they'll then want to charge you. Tunnel Bear that I've listed on there is an example of that. And so if you're going to apply this idea I brought up before of containerization, where you contain your use of a VPN to the particular activities that you want to protect with that VPN, you then only turn it on, the free one, for that particular use case. And then you can consciously turn it off again and go back to your, whatever you're doing before. It sounds like many steps to take, but like I said, this is like a hygienic practice. With a little bit of practice, it gets super easy and you won't have to think about it. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about sharing images. This is another tactic you can use. Oh, sorry for that email noise. Okay, so images are things you probably often share with people for many different reasons, and that might cross different use cases across your digital device or your digital footprint map. Remember I talked about metadata before, which is that data about data. It is the information that's sort of like behind the scenes that you're not usually given insight into, but are important for your computer and other computing devices to rely on to do what they need to do. So one type of metadata that is attached to images is called EXIF data. It's so common now because it is very revealing in the type of information that it shows about the image, like how it was produced, the device it came from, where it might have come from, when. And then when that's pieced together with other things, it can reveal a lot about the person who made that image. So if you're making images about yourself or like of yourself or anything that maybe you want to keep sort of private, you want to get in the practice of what we call stripping the EXIF data from your images. That in itself could be a little mini workshop, but there are a lot of very easy to use third-party, what we call third-party softwares that do this for you. Some of them are free. I recommend those. Some of them are paid. And they really differ very wildly depending on the device that you're using. So rather than giving you some recommendations here, I just recommend you do a web search for how to remove EXIF data, followed by the particular device that you're on. So you might say Mac, like if you're on a MacBook, or a Chromebook, if you have a Chromebook like laptop, Android phone, iPhone, because the technologies really differ across all the different devices that they could be used for. But definitely get in the practice of removing the EXIF data.
Daly, I just want to flag the time. If you can finish the slides in like 5 to 7 minutes so we have some time for questions, that would be awesome.
Yes, absolutely. I think I've only got a few more. Okay. So next up, harden your settings. Every single account that you use online and every piece of software that you use will have an area where you can harden your settings, as we say. Look for the little gear icon is usually how it's like shown. And that's where your settings are. And there'll almost always be a privacy and security tab where you can use a little notch to like up the settings in some way. It really differs across the different things that you're using, but almost always in almost all of these cases, they are legally required to give you the option to harden your settings or to raise the privacy and security settings. And at the same time, it's almost always in their financial best interest to make it confusing for you to do so. However, it's worth looking into, it's worth doing, and with a little bit of practice, you'll begin to recognize the same sorts of terminology and language they use to describe these things. Safe browsing. When you're using your internet browser, again, harden your settings. And there are like some browser extensions and things you can use to make it even more secure. I work on Privacy Badger. It's a browser extension that is just about privacy. So it stops like third-party advertisers and things from tracking what you're doing, identifying who you are, and then telling others about that. So if you've ever had the really unfortunate incident of like having like a suggested friend appear on a profile that you don't want to appear, so maybe like a client you've interacted with is coming up as a suggested friend on your vanilla Facebook account, that's probably because of third-party tracking. And that can be stopped, prevented from things like Privacy Badger. And then there are more intense ones like NoScript, which is about security. Operating systems, that is like the actual, like what your device uses to do anything. It's like the first piece of software that is run on your device that all other software is launched from. These are really complicated sometimes and hard to use. However, if your particular threat model calls for it, they're absolutely worth looking into. I'm a big fan of both of these operating systems. They can get a little tricky to use, like I said, but the payoff is really big and can be quite fun, actually. Okay, so I'm so sorry for that fire hose of information. There was a lot there, a lot I didn't cover. These are all just tips, tricks, tools, tactics, things you can use to beef up your own particular personal digital security hygiene. Remember, it takes practice, and this is a group effort. This is like community caretaking. Caring for yourself is caring for others when it comes to this. I gave some links at the bottom of this slide where a lot of these resources are talked about and developed through EFF. We give some really handy stuff there about like how to make your own plans for upping your data hygiene. And and also like some things there for creating community plans. There are the obvious links for visiting Hacking Hustling. There's EFF.org. Again, that's where I work. There's my email address there. Please always feel free to reach out to me. I love fielding questions from people within the community. And EFF, like we're on the sex worker side. We're the only like organization that is actively litigating against Sesta Fosta. We're suing the government, saying it's unconstitutional, and like this is what we're about. We want to protect each other.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daly. I'm getting some thanks for you in the chat. We're going to take like 10 minutes to answer questions from the chat, and then I don't have to run straight away. Daly, do you?
Nope, I don't. I am here.
Yeah, so we can then turn off the recording, and then folks can feel free to speak if that works for their threat model. So I'm just gonna go through and read a couple of questions. If one has separate phones, personal and professional, which don't overlap in any accounts, but also use a personal laptop for both personal and professional purposes, does it make it safe, secure if the professional stuff is done only incognito mode on Chrome browser, or is there more?
Okay, this is a great there are a couple of thoughts that come up first. So if I understood correctly, there are like multiple like mobile devices that they're using with one like computer, right? First, I want to say if you are plugging in those mobile devices to the same computer, you'll want to link those together on your digital device or your digital footprint map, right? Because if you're syncing your device to your computer in any sort of way, um, uh, then there's some data that's being shared, right, on one device that's now describing the two different cellular devices you're using. And then, like, yes, it is a good practice to like contain your work stuff to that one device, and then to only open up like incognito mode browsers or browser sessions to do work stuff. But I really, really want to stress that incognito mode is not a catch-all. It really, I feel like there is a general misunderstanding that private browsing sessions or incognito modes do more than they actually do. Like, yes, they're good, and it's a good practice to use them, but they don't protect you against a lot of things. In many ways, your IP address can still be seen. You can still be third-party tracked or fingerprinted in those sessions, and you can still reveal yourself in other ways on accident.
Yeah, I think one thing that we didn't talk about, but I think is important, and maybe we were starting to when we were talking about metadata and images, is you can really easily reverse image search a photo. So if you're using the same photo from your personal Facebook and for your work advertisement, if someone sees your work advertisement and just does a reverse image search and your Facebook profile is public, they can find you through that capacity. So one step in digital hygiene that I did for myself when I was, one step that I've made at points in my life is having all of my personal social media, if I have it at all, on private without a face image there. So even if it gets recommended to a friend, my personal social media has a photo of a leaf and a fake name. So
I mean, with that, it's not even about metadata anymore. It's just about the actual image itself and like
right.
composition of the image that can be tracked or traced back to other aspects of your life that you might not want it to. That you can't easily avoid using like technologies. You're not going to turn on a VPN and suddenly be protected against reverse image searching, which is why I really want to advise a more conceptual approach to data hygiene. Like, yes, the technologies I listed, like, or that I sort of described, can do a lot for you, but there's so much more that can be done with just beginning to consciously think about and map out how these things actually work. So, like, I know, I know many people who are very particular about blurring their faces for worker profiles or wearing masks and being very conscious about taking practices like that that are acts of containerization or often steganography to abstract the content that's coming out, the data that is being produced by them, so that it can't be logically traced back to other aspects they don't want it to.
Yeah, I'm seeing someone asking a question. If I use different photos for work and personal, can a client still plug in a work photo into a reverse image search and find similar photos or similar faces? And I think that's getting increasingly scary, especially with like news from like Clearview AI coming out. So I'm interested in your take on that, Daly.
Yeah, ugh, I there is a huge conversation about facial recognition software that I okay.
That's a whole other training.
Yeah, it's really big and it's really, really scary. Um, but what I will say is that the reverse image searching that is available to the average person, so like the average client, they cannot, like, it's not sophisticated enough where they can have just a random image of you and then that is used only for work purposes. and then maybe have it reverse image search back to like, a Facebook image of you at some picnic or something. Like it simply is not sophisticated enough where it can reverse image search back to you just because you have the same face. It relies on a much more exact like composition of the image to link those two things together.
Yeah, and we'll share more resources on some of the things that we're talking about. We'll compile a resource list of like articles if you want to read more about any of these topics that we're not really diving deep in, which are like spend years studying these things and are constantly changing.
Yeah, it really
So
depends on like the attacker that we're thinking of, or the adversary in your threat model. So it's like there's the client who's you don't want to reverse image search back to your vanilla life. They probably won't be able to if you have two distinct different images that you're using, one for personal, one for work. However, if a federal agency or a police officer is the adversary you're now considering, their capabilities are much different.
right,
And
and yeah, and I think with a lot of advertising platforms now requiring ID, the facial recognition component is another step,
right,
another concern from a whole different level. One thing that gives me hope is that my iPhone sees photos of me not in my worker persona, and my worker persona is two different people. So I, I find my like worker performer as a form of drag that like does facial recognition obfuscation, which I enjoy.
awesome.
Okay, so I have another question for you, which is what kind of recommendations do you have for payment platforms right now? Any that are seen for best or protecting your personal legal name, bank information? I'm happy to take that one if you.
I have okay, so I don't have I have thoughts. I don't have
Yeah.
recommendations. My initial thoughts are no payment processor is your friend,
Mm-hmm.
right? And, especially in this business, none of them have your best interest in mind. There are some that particularly profit off of the like not having to explicitly state the purpose or intent of the payment that's being processed, and they will never admit to dealing in like shadier businesses, right? Because they are also required to uphold the law. Um,
Yeah.
all payment processors are.
Right.
A
And oh,
like clients to use like encrypted methods of payment processing. Like you could require clients to pay you in Bitcoin, and that would be secure. That is not feasible, right? So I think in these situations, it's much more useful to rely on your already, I would expect, very sophisticated methods of steganography and well, steganography, yeah, to like to process payments. So describe things differently. You don't have to say explicitly what something is about. If you're using a secure messaging platform to talk to people with, and then
which also only works if they're also using a secure messaging platform, which I think is important for it to be end to end. You should both be using Signal, for example.
yes, yeah, that's not always true for the different technologies.
Mm.
There are some that are more protected than not. Like Proton Mail is a good example that is not protected. Like it's only useful if both people are using Proton Mail accounts. Um, whereas Signal is encrypted no matter what. Um,
That's
uh,
helpful. Thank you.
of course, yeah. I mean,
Um,
there are other considerations to take.
yeah, of course. I want to add about the fintech question. Yes, no financial payment processor is your friend. One harm reduction tool that I do suggest is using like a burner email address, just like a random email address that doesn't have like XXX, I'm a sex worker mistress
Mhm.
at gmail.com, but just like any random, very vanilla, civvy sounding email address that isn't linked on your advertisement, that isn't listed anywhere publicly, and is only shared with safer communications, will significantly reduce the chances of getting deplatformed from financial technologies. And I would always recommend like sending like a $1 payment to a friend before sending that payment information to a client, just to make sure to double check that no personal information is being revealed.
I think like a really useful, I think jumping off that idea, a really useful sort of like mini version of the digital footprint map we made is just one about your registry email addresses, or like the email addresses that you use to register or log into other accounts. Because almost every like software account or social media account that you rely on needs an email address, right? So it's a really great practice to just begin to map out which ones you're using for which, and then you can make sure there's never any crossover. From there, that will inform the rest of your practice about, okay, well, now I know I'm using Catwoman at AOL.com to only log into like this particular Slixa account or whatever. Um, and so then you will only use this particular browser to log into your Catwoman account, then to log into your Slixa account, Twitter, and then you close it all down and start it over again to log into selenakyle at gmail.com, which then goes to your vanilla Facebook and etc.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to just say thank you everyone so much for your time. I want to flag that it's 5:32. So I'm going to take a second to stop the recording, which I'm going to do